It was the 15th of January 1559 when Elizabeth was crowned as the new Queen of England. When our mother recovered from her illness, both Mary and I were summoned back to the palace at Whitehall, where Elizabeth gave us apartments, which we were to retain as our own, even when absent. Her Majesty received us with some display of an affection which she certainly never really felt for either of us. I took the Queen's advances coldly. I was annoyed that Elizabeth refused to accept me as her successor, and my dignity was hurt at the fact that the Queen had only made me one of her ladies of the presence, whereas I was in the privy chamber of the late Queen, who showed me much favour. The present Queen bore me no goodwill, as I saw it. Elizabeth thought it good policy, however, to keep me, of whom she was seriously afraid, near her, because so far as England was concerned I was an even greater danger to the safety of the throne than was Mary Stuart, since my position in the matter of the succession was defined by 2 royal wills and by a special Act of Parliament, whereas the Scotch Queen's was never confirmed either in the wills of Henry VIII or Edward VI, nor by any Act of Parliament. Queen Elizabeth's court formed a striking contrast to that of her sister Mary. Gloriana had restored all the extravagant magnificence of Henry VIII's time, all, save the supreme artistic taste that distinguished the best period of the Renaissance. Absorbed in her political intrigues and her private amusements, Elizabeth, who was the strangest mixture of wisdom and folly that ever occupied a throne, cared very little about her ladies' morals. Provided we were punctually on hand whenever she wanted us, she was content to allow us to go our own ways, always, however, on the condition we created no public scandal. Under these circumstances, I preferred the greater freedom allowed under the Elizabethan regime, to the rigorous round of pious exercises that made up the routine of court life under Queen Mary. But soon I would have to learn the price of that freedom. Meanwhile, in March 1559, Mother being still very sick, we were once more sent for, and, with the Queen's permission, arrived at the Charterhouse at Sheen one windy day towards evening. Mother was in such very bad health that she evidently wished, before leaving this world, to provide me, her eldest surviving daughter, with a husband. She had recently given birth to a child, which had died almost as soon as it was born, but although Mother failed to gain strength, her mind continued very clear. Calling one day Hertford and me to her, she declared it was her opinion that he would make a very suitable husband for me, if the Queen would only see it in the same light, but she would have nothing to do with the matter unless with the Queen's knowledge and consent, and that of her honourable counsel. Mr. Stokes, Mother's husband, then drew Hertford aside and taking him into an inner room held a consultation with him. He thought, as Mother was so near a kinswoman of the Queen, it would be well if she wrote Her Majesty a letter on the subject. This advice pleased Hertford, and the 2 gentlemen set to work to frame what they deemed a suitable letter. Since Mother had gotten much worse, they became greatly alarmed and conceived it to be their duty to act as promptly as possible. They were terribly afraid of Elizabeth, and did not hesitate to say so, even in the presence of the dying woman. So Mother, propped up with cushions and looking very ill indeed, took my hand in hers, and stretching out her other hand to Hertford, said,
"Daughter Kate, I have found a husband for you, if you like well to frame your fancy and goodwill in his direction."
It goes without saying, I replied that I was very willing so to do, as I loved Hertford very dearly. Mr. Stokes then, with the assistance of Hertford, wrote a draft of the letter which was to be addressed to Elizabeth, and which ran much as follows: That such a nobleman did bear goodwill to her daughter the Lady Katherine, and that she did humbly require the Queen's Highness to be good and gracious lady unto her, and that it would please Her Majesty to assent to the marriage of her to the said Earl, which was the only thing she desired before her death, and should be the occasion for her to die the more quietly. This draft of the letter was never sent, and Mr. Stokes would later claim that Hertford would not let him send the letter, for he took fright at the boldness of it and said he would not care to meddle any more in the matter. Mr. Stokes did not seem to think this was a very manly thing on Hertford's part, but Edward in the end was not manly, only a very small, delicate, frail-looking young gentleman. These occurrences took place somewhere in March. Throughout the spring and summer Mother lingered on, a very sick woman, rarely if ever rising from her bed or her couch. We frequently visited her and brought her kind messages and gifts from Elizabeth, who was still in complete ignorance of the matrimonial project. Edward was also a good deal at Sheen, though nothing was determined as to the marriage. It was deemed safest to leave the whole concern in abeyance until after Mother's death, which took place in the presence of her husband and her children on the 20th of November 1559. Elizabeth gave Mother a right royal burial, worthy of a princess of the blood. If I was to describe my feelings upon losing my mother, it was a mixture of grief, anger, regret, fear and loneliness. We had never had warm relationship, she had been distant and cold, but little Mary and I had no other surviving close relatives, and Mother was our only protection in the hostile world of the court life. And she did her best before dying to advance my marriage. Little did she know while giving her blessing, that the last thing Elizabeth wanted was dealing with my offsprings as potential heirs to the throne. Dealing with me was already, according to her own words, difficult enough for her. Upon our return to Westminster, Her Majesty welcomed us with much apparent sympathy. She was, or pretended to be, most affectionate to us, and even called me her daughter, although the feeling between us could hardly have been that of mother and child. But the Queen had thought best to put me in her chamber and make much of me in order to keep me quiet. She even started talking about formally adopting me. Whilst still in the early weeks of my mourning for my mother, I received information that greatly distressed me. I was told that Edward had been paying his addresses to the daughter of Sir Peter Metres, a piece of news that made me very jealous and unhappy. Seeing the state of nervous prostration into which I was thrown by Hertford's alleged infidelity, his sister Jane Seymour insisted upon knowing what was the matter. I confessed to her tearfully that I had heard there was lovemaking between Mistress Metres and Lord Hertford. On the following day, Jane obtained leave to go to Hanworth, where Hertford was staying with his mother, the Duchess of Somerset. She taxed her brother, in no measured terms, with his lack of fidelity to me, to which he replied that he knew nothing of the matter of the daughter of Sir Peter Metres, that the whole story was a falsehood and that he was willing to live or die for my sake. He added that if I consented to marry him, he was willing to defy Elizabeth, and he thought that the sooner the marriage took place the better, and so saying he drew from his finger a ring with a pointed diamond in it, and gave it to his sister to carry to me. Armed with this bond of peace, Lady Jane Seymour returned to London and she gave to me the ring and her brother's message. That made me deeply relieved for a while, and I became once more my cheerful self. In the year 1560, Elizabeth's position became very precarious. Her popularity was rapidly diminishing, owing to the evil reports spread abroad by her enemies, with respect to the nature of her intimacy with the Lord Robert Dudley. It was all over the court, that they slept in contiguous rooms, that she never let him out of her sight. Meanwhile, a rumour was circulating to the effect that Robert Dudley's wife, who was in the country, was sick of a malady of the breasts and like to die. On a close examination of the documents connected with the singular death of Amy Robsart, no mention was found whatever of this malady. Elizabeth might have made up her mind that should the Lady Robert Dudley conveniently depart this life at an early date, she would marry the widower. All these and many other open and covert attacks on the Queen's character were damaging her good name with the people, to such an extent that it was actually proposed to dethrone her and to replace her by some more suitable successor. The English Catholics naturally favoured the Queen of Scots, but my figure was preferred by Spain. King Philip all his life certainly regretted the loss of Spanish influence in English politics, which came to an end on the death of Queen Mary, and he determined to regain it at any cost. I, on account of my supposed leaning towards Catholicism and my friendship for the Countess and Count of Feria, who was the Spanish ambassador at court, was regarded by the Spanish king as the most likely medium for realizing his hopes. The earliest was a plot for secretly abducting me to Spain. There I was to be married to Don Carlos, the king's son, or to the Archduke Ferdinand, or some other Spanish prince, and put forward by Philip as Elizabeth's immediate successor or even rival, my claims to the throne being supported by all the might of Spain, in opposition to those of Mary Queen of Scots, the candidate favoured by France. Apparently Philip, misled by his ambassadors who miscalculated the extent of Elizabeth's unpopularity, failed to realize how strong was the anti-Spanish feeling which existed in England, and did not perceive the enormous difficulties which would have to be surmounted before I could be placed on the throne. The Spaniards thought I would not be unwilling to accept the proposal to leave England, since I was said to be very unhappy at home. Elizabeth, whatever may have been her outward demonstrations of affection, at heart disliked me, and I reciprocated this dislike. The Countess of Feria was considered the most suitable person to approach me with reference to my leaving England, but meanwhile, Queen Elizabeth must have learned of the plot and was determined secretly to frustrate it. The Queen's open hostility to Feria and above all to his wife became so unbearable that he could stand it no longer, and, inventing an excuse for relinquishing his mission, forthwith returned to Flanders, departing from London in haste. The Countess followed him a few months later. So the plot of abducting me came to an abrupt. Elizabeth, however, could not be brought to believe that the original scheme had been abandoned. On Sunday, the 8th of September of 1560, Lady Dudley fell down a back staircase at Cumnor Hall, and was found dead at the bottom. The following day, a messenger was sent to Dudley, who was in attendance on the Queen at Windsor, informing him that his wife had been killed by falling downstairs, whilst all the servants were absent from the house. Dudley, who manifested neither surprise nor much concern, stated that he did not believe his wife's death had been the result of accident, but was an act of premeditated violence, and added that he feared he would be implicated in the matter. It was difficult not to feel fairly certain that, notwithstanding Robert Dudley's persistent declarations of innocence, he was guilty, and that Amy Robsart was foully murdered by his orders and with Elizabeth's knowledge and consent. It was generally believed in London that Dudley had prearranged the murder of his wife, with the intention of marrying the Queen as soon as possible. Cecil, who was the secretary, evidently believed this version of the story, and being greatly disgusted at it, turned his attention in my direction. There was fear in Elizabeth's government that if the Queen were to die, the King of Spain would get the kingdom into his family by means of my person. Cecil told the new Spanish ambassador that it would be well if a marriage should take place between me and one of Philip's relations, and that I should succeed by virtue of the will of King Henry. The ambassador asked Cecil if he thought the Queen would declare me heiress to the crown, to which Cecil answered that certainly not, because as the saying is, the English run after the heir to the crown more than after the present wearer of it. With such high interests at stake, Quadra, the new Spanish ambassador, who had already been for some time extremely anxious to marry the Archduke Ferdinand either to Elizabeth or, failing her, to me, wrote to the Spanish king, that this hatred of the Lord Robert would continue, as government cannot put up with his being king, and the Archduke might be summoned to marry me, to whom the kingdom falls if Elizabeth dies. Unfortunately for this scheme, the Archduke never saw me, and the proposed match fell through. Elizabeth found out this intrigue, and resented it, and it was one of the many reasons for her hatred of me. The ridiculous thing was that I was totally unaware of the numerous plots concerning my position as Elizabeth's heiress. Hertford, never very courageous, was growing alarmed. He knew that the Queen, who at one time had called me her daughter, now expressed her contempt for me and also kept me as far removed from her person as possible, frowning upon me whenever we passed each other. He therefore despaired of ever obtaining Elizabeth's consent to our marriage. Moreover, he was reminded by Cecil of the existence of a law passed by Henry VIII's Privy Council and ratified by Parliament, that inflicted the severest punishment, imprisonment for life and a fine so enormous as to absorb an earl's income, upon any man who should marry a kinswoman of the crown without the king's consent. Cecil, who was probably actuated much more by political motives than by any personal desire to save Hertford from the fate which awaited him if he married me, came upon him one day and asked him point-blank whether there was not goodwill between him and me. Hertford's prompt but untruthful reply was that there was no such thing. A little later on, after the marriage had actually taken place, Cecil tried to find out from me how matters stood. Always haunted by the idea that one day I might succeed Elizabeth as queen, he was anxious to try to prevent a marriage which, as he wisely foresaw, would injure my cause yet further in the Queen's eyes. Later on I said that the warning, if it had been given before the marriage, might have been heeded. Prompted by Cecil, 2 more courtiers also approached me on the subject, advising me to beware of the company and familiarity of the said earl. However, none of these worthy interferes had a very high opinion, since their advice, which indeed came too late, was disregarded.